Let's start with waking. So regardless of how well you slept at night or whether or not you were up all night, most people tend to wake up sometime around when the sun rises. Maybe not right at sunrise, but within an hour or two or maybe 3 of sunrise. Now, I realize there are night shift workers and there are people traveling and experiencing jet lag where this is not going to be the case. We are going to deal with jet lag and shift work at the end of this podcast. But for most people, we tend to wake up about the time that the sun is rising or so. And as we do that, adenosine levels tend to be low if we've been asleep for reasons that you now understand. And our system generates an internal signal that is in the form of a hormone. Now, I've talked a lot about neuromodulators and neurotransmitters. I haven't talked a lot about hormones yet on this podcast. The definition of a hormone is it's a substance, a chemical, that's released from one organ in your body that goes and acts on other organs elsewhere in your body, including your nervous system. When you wake up in the morning, you wake up because a particular hormone called cortisol is released from your adrenal glands. Your adrenal glands sit right above your kidneys, and there's a little pulse of cortisol. There's also a pulse of some, and when I say a pulse, I just mean the release of a little bit. There's also a pulse of epinephrine, which is adrenaline, from your adrenals and also in your brain, and you feel awake. Now, that pulse of cortisol and adrenaline and epinephrine might come from your alarm clock. It might come from you naturally waking up. But it tends to alert your whole system in your body that it's time to increase your heart rate, it's time to start tensing your muscles, it's time to start moving about. It's very important that cortisol pulse come early in the day, or at least early in your period of wakefulness. I say that because some people are waking up at 8 p.m. and are sleeping all day. But it's very important that pulse of cortisol occur early in the day and that it happens all at once. It sort of sets a rising tide of cortisol in your system. Now, many of you have probably heard about cortisol in relation to stress. And indeed, as we go through our day and our life, different stressors, different events happen in our life that make us feel more alert. Some of the more stressful ones might be looking at your credit card bill and seeing what seems to be a fraudulent charge, or looking at your phone and suddenly seeing a text that something you thought was going to happen at a particular time is not going to happen, or you're running late. Those will tend to increase norepinephrine and epinephrine and adrenaline in your system. And if they're severe enough, you'll start getting some pulses of cortisol released from your adrenals throughout the day. But there's this normal, healthy, rising tide of cortisol that happens early in the day. And I say healthy because it wakes you up. It makes you feel alert. It makes you feel able to move and wanting to move and to go out your day for work, for exercise, for school, for social relations, etc. So when you wake up in the morning is when that cortisol pulse takes off. And something else important happens. A timer is set in your body and in your nervous system that dictates when a different hormone called melatonin, which makes you sleepy, will be secreted from a particular brain region. So let's talk about that. When you wake up in the morning and you experience that rise in cortisol, there's a timer that starts going, and these are cellular timers, and they're dictated by the relation between different organs in your body, that says to your brain and body that in about 12 to 14 hours, a different hormone, this hormone we're calling melatonin, will be released from your pineal gland. So there's two mechanisms here, a wakefulness signal and a sleepiness signal. And the wakefulness signal triggers the onset of the timer for the sleepiness signal. Now that sleepiness signal that we call melatonin that's released from the pineal comes only from the pineal. Unless you're taking exogenous melatonin, you're supplementing with melatonin, the only source of melatonin in your body is going to be this pineal gland. So let's talk about the pineal gland for a second. The pineal gland is a gland that sits kind of in the little structure near, for the aficionados out there, it's kind of near the fourth ventricle. It's about the size of a pea. Descartes, the philosopher, said that the pineal was the seat of the soul. He said that because it's one of the few structures in the human brain that there's only one of them. You know, most structures, there's one on either side of the brain, so-called bihemispheric, but the pineal, there's only one. I don't know anything about souls, really. Certainly not the science of souls, but I think it's very unlikely that the pineal is the seat of the soul, but it is a very interesting organ because it's the only organ in our body that releases melatonin. And that melatonin makes us sleepy and lets us fall asleep. Now, I'm guessing that many of you are probably asking, should I take melatonin? My personal bias on this is, except in rare cases, no, for the following reason. Melatonin has a second function, which is that melatonin also suppresses the onset of puberty. In kids, and especially in babies, melatonin isn't just released in the evening, 12 to 16 hours after we wake. Melatonin is released chronically or tonically throughout the day and night. And that chronic or tonic release of melatonin is known to suppress some of the other hormones in other regions of the brain that trigger the onset of puberty. Now, if you or your child has been taking melatonin, don't freak out. As always, any kind of supplement or anything that you're going to take or think about taking, you really need to consult with your doctor. I've said this many times on this podcast, and it's in the show notes, etc. But before you remove anything or add anything to what you're already doing, please do consult with a healthcare professional. However, melatonin is known to suppress the onset of puberty, so much so that regular cycled periods of melatonin release from the pineal really correlate with the onset of puberty and early adulthood. Meaning, as we start secreting melatonin only at night, that's also when we tend to transition out of puberty. Now, there are a lot of things that correlate in our nervous system, so that doesn't necessarily mean it controls it. But in this case, we know, based on lots of data, endocrinology and so forth, that melatonin suppresses the onset of puberty. So supplementing melatonin could be problematic for that reason. But if you've already gone through puberty, it could also have some impact on other hormone systems in your body. So that's why I personally don't like to use melatonin to fall asleep. There's another reason, which is that melatonin will help you fall asleep, but it won't help you stay asleep. And many people who take melatonin find that they wake up 3 to 5 hours later unable to fall back asleep. Part of the reason for that might be that melatonin purchased, you can buy it over the counter in most areas of the world, even though it's a hormone, which is a little unusual. You can't just go into a pharmacy, at least in the US, and buy testosterone or cortisol or estrogen. You need a prescription, but you can go buy melatonin for whatever reason. I don't know the reasons for that legality. But it's been shown many times, and now I'm borrowing from some items that were in Matt Walker's book, Why We Sleep, where he stated there is evidence that in commercially available melatonin, the amount of melatonin has been tested for various brands, and it can range anywhere from being 15% of what's listed on the bottle. Okay, so if they list this is 100 milligrams, would be a tremendously high dose. It turns out it's only 15 milligrams in that particular pill or capsule, or up to 400 times more than what's listed on the bottle. So it's completely unregulated. And so for those of you taking melatonin, I will discuss at the end of the podcast some other potential alternatives that are probably safer and don't have these issues. So should you take melatonin? My personal bias is no, but for many people, they find that it does help them. And so if you do find it helps you, then just consider what I'm saying in light of the other practices that you're doing and talk to your healthcare professional.